The morning Caroline Bishop climbed onto the roof of the Harlan County Land Office. The sky above Dusty Creek, Texas, was the color of a bruise, purple and angry at the edges, as if the heavens themselves knew something righteous and terrible was about to happen. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Dusty Creek sat in the crease between two low hills in the Texas Panhandle like a coin dropped and forgotten. The main street was packed dirt, the color of old rust, and it smelled of horse and wood smoke and something else entirely, the particular scent of a place where men made decisions that ruined other people's lives and slept soundly afterward. There were 12 buildings of consequence on that street, and the land office was the one that mattered most in the months since Thomas Bishop had died of a fever that came on fast and left just as quickly, taking him with it before his wife could even boil the water the doctor had asked for. Caroline had been a widow for 4 months. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of face that had once been called pretty and had since become something more than that, something harder and more interesting, shaped by sun and grief and 2 years of working land that did not always want to be worked. She was not a frail woman. Thomas had known that when he married her, had loved her for it in fact, had said once while they were sitting on the porch after a long day that she was the most determined person he had ever known, and he had meant it as the highest compliment a man of his word could offer. The land they had worked together, 160 acres of decent grass and stubborn soil out along Cutter's Creek, had been granted to Thomas under the Homestead Act of 1862. They had proved it up together. They had built the house together, a 2-room structure that started as a single room and grew when Caroline decided it needed to grow. They had planted together, failed together, persisted together. They had raised a daughter together. Lily was 8 years old now, with her father's green eyes and her mother's way of setting her jaw when she had made up her mind about something. After Thomas died, Caroline went to the land office as was proper and as was necessary, and she discovered something that threatened to swallow her whole. The land, the man behind the counter told her, could not be transferred into her name. The original patent had been issued to Thomas Bishop, and upon his death, the matter of inheritance required the case to be reviewed by the district land commissioner. That was fine, she thought. She understood bureaucracy. She had lived in Texas long enough to understand that paper moved slower than molasses in January. But then the months passed. January became February, February became March, and March was threatening to become April without a single word from the district land commissioner. And in that time, she had learned something else entirely, something that made the blood run cold in her veins and the determination harden in her chest like a stone. A man named Eli Crabb had filed a competing claim on the same parcel of land. Eli Crabb, who owned the Crabb Cattle Company, who had been trying to expand his grazing range for years, who had more money and more connections than any one man in Harlan County had a right to possess. The claim was fraudulent. Caroline knew it was fraudulent. The land had been proved up by Thomas and by her, side by side, 4 years of labor and love and stubborn persistence. But Eli Crabb had a lawyer who wore a clean suit and spoke in complete sentences, and Caroline had a dead husband, a daughter, and $83 in a tin box under the floorboard. She went to the land office 4 times in March. Each time the man behind the counter, a soft-bodied, slope-shouldered fellow named Gerald Potts, told her the land commissioner had not yet reviewed her case. Each time, she asked when he expected the commissioner to do so. Each time, Gerald Potts gave her a look that communicated, quite clearly, that her persistence was an annoyance rather than a legitimate exercise of her rights, and he told her these things take time. On the morning of April the 3rd, 1882, Caroline Bishop had been awake since before dawn. She had fed Lily breakfast, braided her daughter's hair, and walked her 2 streets over to the home of Martha Henley, who had 3 children of her own, and had offered to watch Lily on days when Caroline needed her hands free. Martha had looked at Caroline that morning and said, "What are you planning to do?" And Caroline had said, "Whatever I have to." She arrived at the land office at 7 in the morning, a full hour before Gerald Potts unlocked the front door. She stood in the street and looked at the building. It was a single-story structure of whitewashed wood with a flat-topped false front that made it look taller than it was, which was appropriate, she thought, for a building that made itself seem more important and more permanent than it actually deserved to be. The false front had a wide, flat top. And along the side of the building, where the alley ran between the land office and the dry goods store, there was a stack of wooden crates that the dry goods man had left there, because he had not yet decided what else to do with them. Caroline had planned this. She was not an impulsive woman. She had thought about it for 3 days, had lain awake calculating angles and intentions and consequences, and she had decided that she had tried the reasonable methods, and the reasonable methods had produced nothing. So she was going to try something else. She pulled her skirts up, tucked them into her belt in a way that would have horrified her mother-in-law, climbed up the crates with the steadiness of a woman who had been climbing things all her life, and pulled herself up onto the roof of the Harlan County Land Office before a single soul on that street had turned a corner. The roof was flat and gritty underfoot, covered with a layer of tar paper that had begun to crack and buckle at the edges. It was warmer up here than it was on the street, and the view was something. She could see the whole of Dusty Creek laid out before her, the livery stable, the hotel, the 3 saloons, the church on the far end, whose congregation she had stopped attending after the reverend delivered a sermon about how widow women ought to depend on the generosity of their community, rather than troubling themselves with legal matters beyond their natural understanding. She sat down cross-legged on that roof, and she waited. Gerald Potts arrived at 8 and he nearly dropped his keys when he looked up and saw her sitting there. He squinted. He said her name once as a question. She said good morning. He told her to come down at once. She said she would come down when someone had agreed to hear her case. By 8:30, a small crowd had gathered in the street below. By 9 o'clock, the crowd was larger, and it included men who had come from the hardware store and the barber shop and the hotel, and 2 women in aprons who had walked over from the bakery on the side street. People looked up at her with expressions ranging from bafflement to open admiration, though the admiration tended to be quieter and more private, the sort of thing a person shows only with the corner of their eye. Gerald Potts sent a boy for the sheriff. The sheriff of Dusty Creek was a man named August Cole, who was 57 years old and deeply averse to any situation that required him to think quickly. He stood below the roof and told Caroline in measured tones that she was creating a public disturbance. She told him, in equally measured tones, that the public seemed quite interested in being disturbed, and that she would be happy to discuss the matter of public disturbance after someone had discussed the matter of her land claim. That was when Simon Rhodes rode into town. He came in from the Eastern Road, which was the road that connected Dusty Creek to the county seat at Maristown, and he was riding a bay horse with a white blaze down its nose. And he was the kind of man who had the bearing of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors without entirely losing the habit of careful thought. He was 34 years old, lean through the jaw, wide through the shoulder, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a quality about his eyes that was not exactly hardness and not exactly softness, but something between the two. The look of a man who had seen enough of the world to know how difficult it actually was, and who had chosen, in spite of that knowledge, to keep his moral compass reasonably calibrated. Simon Rhodes was the newly appointed Deputy Land Commissioner for the District of Harlan County, sent from the General Land Office in Austin to clear a backlog of cases that had been accumulating under the previous commissioner, who had retired abruptly under circumstances that the General Land Office was still investigating. Simon had been in this role for 3 weeks. He had spent those 3 weeks riding a circuit of the county, reviewing claims, inspecting files, and being generally horrified by the state of record-keeping he had inherited. He had not expected to arrive in Dusty Creek to find a woman sitting on the roof of the land office. He pulled up his horse at the edge of the crowd and looked up. He could see her clearly, dark hair pinned, but beginning to come loose in the morning wind, her back straight, her expression the particular kind of calm that a person achieves not by having no feelings, but by having decided that feelings will not be permitted to interfere with their purpose. She was looking down at August Cole with the patient, measured attention of a woman who had infinite amounts of time and was not in the least bit concerned about spending it this way. Something stirred in Simon's chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He dismounted. He tied the bay to the post in front of the dry goods store. He walked through the crowd, which parted around him partly because he was moving with purpose and partly because the star on his vest, a deputy commissioner's badge, caught the morning light and made people briefly uncertain whether they ought to know who he was. He stood at the base of the building and looked up at Caroline Bishop. "Ma'am," he said. She looked down at him. She took in the badge, the horse, the posture. "Are you here to tell me to come down?" she said. "I am here," he said, "because this is the land office I have been assigned to review, and apparently I have arrived at an interesting moment. What is your name?" She studied him for a long moment, deciding. "Caroline Bishop," she said. "My late husband, Thomas Bishop, filed a homestead claim on 160 acres along Cutter's Creek in 1878. We proved it up. He died in December. I have been trying to get the title transferred into my name since January, and for 4 months this office has told me my case is under review while a cattle man named Eli Crabb has filed a competing claim that he has no legal right to file." Simon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been up there?" "About 2 hours," she said. "Are you planning to come down any time soon?" "I am planning," she said with great precision, "to come down when someone has agreed to hear my case. Not reviewed it, not put it under continued review, heard it, in front of me, with me present to speak." Simon looked at her for another moment. Then he turned to Gerald Potts, who was hovering anxiously behind him. "Get me the Bishop file," he said. Gerald Potts began to say something about the proper procedure for reviewing files. Simon looked at him with the expression of a man who has a great deal to do and very little patience for procedural obstruction used as a stalling technique, and Potts went inside and got the file. Simon opened it right there on the wooden steps of the land office. The file was thin, which was itself notable. There were the original homestead papers, filed by Thomas Bishop in 1878, properly completed and stamped. There were the proof of cultivation documents, signed by 2 witnesses. There was a certificate of completion from 1880, indicating that the Bishops had satisfied all requirements of the Homestead Act. There was a death certificate for Thomas Bishop, filed in December of 1881. There was a letter from Caroline Bishop, dated January 8, 1882, requesting the transfer of title. There was the competing claim filed by one Eli Crabb, dated January 20, 1882, 12 days after Caroline's letter, claiming that the land in question had never been properly proved up and was available for new filing. Simon read it all twice. His jaw had tightened perceptibly by the time he finished. He looked up at Caroline. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "I am going to hear your case, right now. I need you to come down so we can go inside and do this properly." She looked at him. "You are not going to tell me to wait another week." "No," he said. "I am going to hear your case today. I give you my word on that." The crowd had gone very quiet. Several people were watching this exchange, with the intensity of people who had been waiting a long time for something to go the right way. Caroline Bishop looked at Simon Rhodes for a long moment, assessing him the way a woman who has been disappointed by official people assesses a new official person, with great care and no automatic charity. What she found in his face was not the soft reassurance of a man trying to manage a difficult situation, but something more honest than that. She found the particular steadiness of a man who meant exactly what he said, and would be embarrassed later if he turned out not to have meant it. She stood up, which drew a soft collective sound from the crowd below. She walked to the edge of the roof where the crates were, and she climbed down, carefully, with the unhurried competence of a woman who had not lost her nerve once in the last 4 months and was not about to start now. When her feet touched the ground, she was closer to Simon Rhodes than she had expected, and she straightened her skirts and looked at him directly. Up close, she could see that his eyes were gray, the particular shade of gray that changes with the light the way sky does, and that there was something in them that was not pity and not amusement, but something quieter and more respectful than either. "Thank you," she said, meaning it precisely as much as the situation required and not one syllable more. "Come inside," he said. The hearing took place in the small back room of the land office, around a table scarred by years of maps and documents, and the general abrasion of people deciding other people's fates across its surface. Simon sat on one side with the file open before him. Caroline sat on the other side with her hands folded on the table and her back straight as a fence post. Gerald Potts stood in the corner, apparently uncertain what to do with himself. Simon went through the documents one by one. He asked Caroline to describe the improvements they had made to the land. She described them in detail. The house, the fencing, the well they had dug in the summer of 1879, which had taken Thomas 3 weeks of hard labor and a sprained shoulder. The 40 acres of corn they had put in for 2 consecutive seasons. The small kitchen garden that had saved them a hard winter when the prices at the dry goods store got away from them. She spoke without sentimentality, with the precise inventory of a woman who had been there for all of it, and remembered it clearly because it was hers and Thomas's, and the result of years of combined effort. Simon listened. He asked clarifying questions that demonstrated he understood the requirements of the Homestead Act, not in the abstract way of a man who has read about it, but in the specific way of a man who has applied it in practice and knows exactly what it requires and what it does not. Then he asked about Eli Crabb's claim. Caroline told him what she knew. Crabb had approached Thomas the year before, had offered to buy the land at a price that was insultingly low, and Thomas had refused. 3 weeks after Thomas died, Crabb's lawyer had filed the competing claim on the basis that the homestead had not been properly proved up, which was demonstrably false given that the certificate of completion was sitting right there in the file in Simon's hands. Simon was quiet for a long moment after she finished. He looked at the certificate. He looked at the competing claim. He looked at the dates very carefully. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "the competing claim filed by Crabb's company is invalid on its face. The certificate of completion was issued in 1880 and properly recorded. The land was proved up. Crabb's attorney has claimed it was not, which is either a factual error or deliberate misrepresentation to this office." "Which do you think it is?" Caroline said. Simon looked at her with something that was very close to a smile, though it had not quite committed to becoming one. "I think," he said carefully, "that it would be unusual for an experienced attorney to make that particular factual error accidentally." "Then what happens now?" she said. "Now," said Simon, "I write my findings in the official record, which will indicate that the Bishop Homestead claim is valid, complete, and should be transferred into your name as surviving spouse and co-developer of the claim. The competing Crabb filing will be noted as having been reviewed and found to be without merit. That recommendation goes to the General Land Office in Austin, and barring extraordinary circumstances, it will be ratified within 30 days. Caroline was quiet. The relief was enormous, but she kept it contained, held it like water in cupped hands, careful not to spill it before she was certain it was real. 30 days, she said. 30 days, he confirmed. "I am sorry it took 4 months to get to this point. It should not have." There was something in the way he said that last sentence, something that acknowledged more than procedural inefficiency, that acknowledged the wrong of it specifically, that made Caroline look at him again with slightly different eyes. "No," she said, "it should not have." She left the land office and walked to Martha Henley's house to collect Lily. The sun had climbed properly into the sky by now, and the street was going about its business again, the crowd dispersed, the morning's drama already becoming tomorrow's story. She felt hollowed out in the good way that comes after a long, sustained effort, the way a person feels when they have done the thing they needed to do, and it has not been for nothing. Lily, when she was told that things were going to be all right, nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who has understood from watching her mother that all right is sometimes a thing that requires a fight before it arrives. That evening, Caroline went home to her farm. It was a 2-hour ride on her mare, a gray called Hazel that had belonged to Thomas, and had since transferred her primary loyalty to Caroline with the pragmatic ease of a horse who recognized the person who fed her. The land was greening up properly now, the spring grass coming in along the creek, the cottonwoods leafing out along the water's edge. She sat on the porch after Lily was in bed and looked at it in the last of the light and felt, for the first time since December, that it was genuinely hers. Simon Rhodes stayed in Dusty Creek for longer than his original schedule had intended. This was partly because the land office files were in a worse state than he had initially assessed, full of improperly documented claims, conflicting records, and several cases that shared certain characteristics with the crab situation that made Simon's professional instincts very alert. He wrote lengthy reports to Austin. He requested additional documentation from 3 different parties. He set up temporary office hours in the back room of the land office that Gerald Potts, who was becoming marginally less obstinate now that someone with actual authority was present, facilitated with grudging cooperation. And it was partly because of something else, something he was less inclined to examine too directly in the first week, and then found increasingly difficult to ignore in the second. He had ridden out to the Bishop homestead on April the 5th, 2 days after the hearing, to inspect the claim in person as was required for his official report. Caroline had met him at the gate with the manner of a woman who was willing to be civil and nothing more, who had dealt with enough official visits to have her defenses up as a matter of course. She had shown him the house, the fencing, the well, the fields, all of it exactly as she had described, and he had written his notes with the careful thoroughness of a man who knew that every detail he recorded was a brick in the wall between her and Eli Crabb's lawyers. She had offered him coffee before he left. He had accepted. They had sat on the porch for 20 minutes while Lily climbed the fence rails nearby with the casual fearlessness of a child who has never been told she cannot, and Simon had drunk his coffee and looked out at the land and said, "This is good land." "Yes," Caroline said, "it is. Your husband knew what he was looking at when he filed for it." "We both did," she said. "We rode out together before he filed, spent a whole day walking it. I knew before he did that it was right." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of notable. "How long were you married?" he asked. 6 years, she said. "He was a good man, stubborn in all the right ways and steady." "Those are good things to be." "They are," she agreed. He left an hour later and rode back toward town, and the whole way back he was aware of something sitting in his chest that had not been there that morning, something he did not immediately name because he was a careful man who had learned the cost of naming things before he was certain of them. He had been engaged once, 7 years ago, to a woman named Eliza back in Tennessee, where he had grown up and studied law and worked briefly in a county clerk's office before the West had called to him with a particular insistence that he had never been fully able to explain to people who had not heard that same call. Eliza had not wanted to go west. He had understood that. They had parted ways with more sorrow than anger, which was perhaps the hardest kind of parting, and he had gone to Texas and found his footing slowly and built a life that was useful and purposeful if occasionally lonely in the particular way that a life without someone to speak plainly to can be lonely, even when it is full of activity. He had not thought seriously about a woman since Eliza, not in the way that counted. He thought about Caroline Bishop the whole ride back to Dusty Creek, and then told himself firmly that she was a woman in a difficult situation who had just lost her husband 4 months ago, and that he was the official reviewing her case, and that there were multiple excellent reasons why he should keep his thoughts organized and professional. He was moderately successful at this for approximately 2 days. On April the 7th, he saw her in the street. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a sack of flour, and she had Lily with her. And Lily was explaining something with great urgency that involved extensive use of both hands to illustrate the point. Caroline was listening with the full attention of a mother who takes her child's narrative seriously, which is a specific and underappreciated quality that Simon noticed with something that registered very clearly as warmth. He tipped his hat. She nodded. Lily stopped her story long enough to look at him and then said to her mother, "Is that the man from the roof?" Caroline said. "He was not on the roof, Lily." "You were on the roof," Lily said, clarifying this for Simon's benefit. "Mama was on the roof of the land building because they would not listen." "I know," Simon said, speaking to Lily but aware of Caroline beside her. "Your mama was very right to do what she did." Lily considered this with the seriousness of 8 years old. "She said a person is entitled to be heard," Lily said. "She said that a lot while she was getting ready." "Your mama," Simon said, "is a wise woman." Caroline had colored slightly, which was the first time he had seen any color in her face that was not the healthy outdoors color of a woman who spent time in the sun, and she said, "We should be getting on," and picked up her flour sack and they went. But she had looked back once, just briefly, at the end of the street, and Simon Rhodes had been standing right where she left him. The crab situation did not resolve quietly. On April the 12th, Eli Crab himself came to Dusty Creek, which he rarely bothered to do since he considered himself above the ordinary commerce of the town. He was a large man, heavy-set and red-faced, with the prosperous belly of someone who had eaten well for many years, and the eyes of someone who had grown accustomed to getting what they wanted. He came to the land office with his lawyer, a man named Vickers who wore the clean suit Caroline had mentioned, and who had the particular smooth-talking manner of someone who has learned to make wrong things sound reasonable. Simon met with them in the back room. He was courteous and precise. He explained his findings. Vickers attempted to suggest that Simon's review had been hasty, and that there were procedural irregularities in the original Bishop claim that warranted further examination. Simon laid out the documentation one piece at a time, and asked Vickers to identify specifically which requirement of the Homestead Act he believed had not been satisfied. Vickers became vague, which is what men do when they are asked specific questions about claims they have no genuine basis for. Crab leaned forward at one point and said, in the manner of a man who has found that direct communication of his power often saves time, that he was a significant property owner in the county, and that the county's business interests would be better served by a favorable resolution of this matter. Simon looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Crab," he said, "I work for the General Land Office in Austin. My responsibility is to the accurate administration of federal land claims. I appreciate you explaining your perspective, but I want to be very clear that the Bishop claim is valid and that my recommendation to Austin will reflect that finding." Crab left in a bad temper. Vickers left with the look of a lawyer calculating his next move. Simon wrote a supplemental report that evening that included a detailed note about the Crab filing and the manner in which it had been pursued, language that would make its way into the permanent record, and that would make it considerably more difficult for similar tactics to be used against the Bishop claim in the future. He found himself, at 10 o'clock that evening, sitting in the hotel dining room with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and his report finished, thinking about Caroline Bishop in a way that had definitively crossed the line from professional consideration into something else. He thought about the particular quality of her voice, which was not soft exactly but precise, every word chosen and placed deliberately, the voice of a woman who had learned that words were tools and that careless use of them cost you. He thought about the way she looked at Lily, the full attention quality of it, which he had observed twice now. He thought about what she had said about knowing the land was right before Thomas did. He thought about the roof. There was something about the image of her sitting up there, cross-legged on that tar-paper roof in the early morning, settled into her position with the patience of someone who has decided that this is where she will be until justice arrives, that had lodged itself in him in a way he could not dislodge. It was not a small thing, what she had done. It was not the action of a woman making a scene. It was the action of a woman who had calculated that all the ordinary methods available to her had been exhausted or weaponized against her, and who had therefore invented an extraordinary method, and who had then executed it with complete self-possession. He drank the cold coffee and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. On April the 15th, he rode out to the Bishop homestead again, and this time it was not strictly required for his official report, which was essentially complete. He told himself he was conducting a follow-up inspection, which was a thing he told himself with the full awareness that it was only partially true. Caroline was mending fence on the east side of the property when he arrived. She had her sleeves rolled up and a hammer in one hand, and she was assessing a leaning fence post with the critical eye of a woman who knows exactly what is needed, and is debating whether she has the time and materials to do it properly right now. She looked up when she heard the horse, and her expression went through a brief sequence of surprise and assessment before settling into something that was not quite guardedness, but was the posture she wore around official people. "Commissioner Rhodes," she said. "Mrs. Bishop," he said. He dismounted. He looked at the fence post. "That one needs to come out and be reset," he said. "I know," she said. "I do not currently have someone to help me hold it while I tamp the earth around it." He tied his horse to a standing post. He looked at her. "I have some time," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." They worked on the fence for an hour. He held the posts while she tamped, and then they switched because it turned out she could judge the line of a fence rail by eye in a way that was more accurate than his, and it made practical sense to arrange themselves accordingly. They did not talk very much while they were working, which was its own kind of comfortable, the ease of two people who are both accustomed to labor and do not need to fill silence with noise in order to feel that the other person is still present. When they had fixed the fence to Caroline's satisfaction, she said he could stay for dinner if he liked. She said it plainly, without fuss, as a practical extension of what they had just done together. He said yes just as plainly. Lily was delighted by the dinner guest in the way that children are delighted by changes in routine, and she talked to Simon with the unself-conscious directness of a child who has been raised by a woman who speaks plainly, asking him where he lived before Texas, and whether he had ever ridden a horse that threw him, and whether he thought the cottonwood tree at the creek would last another 10 years because she had a plan for it that required it to last. He answered all her questions with equal seriousness, and she approved of him in the unconditional way children sometimes approve of adults who take them seriously, which Caroline observed from across the table with an expression that she had not allowed herself to use in someone else's presence for a very long time. After dinner, after Lily had gone to bed, they sat on the porch in the early dark, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and the stars came out over the Texas panhandle in the way they do when there is no city anywhere near enough to diminish them. "Can I ask you something?" Simon said. "You can ask," she said. "Were you frightened? On the roof?" She thought about it. "Not of the height," she said. "I was a little frightened that it would not work, that they would wait me out or drag me down or simply ignore me until I got cold and hungry and gave up. That is the thing people try against women who make a fuss. They simply wait. But they did not wait you out," he said. "You arrived," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was careful and honest at the same time, acknowledging something without committing to what she was acknowledging. "I was lucky to arrive when I did," he said. "So was I," she said quietly. The silence after that was different from the working silence. It had something in it. The way silence sometimes has something in it when two people are sitting close enough to be aware of each other, and neither is inclined to pretend otherwise. He stayed another hour, and then rode back to town, and Caroline sat on the porch alone after he left and looked at the stars and thought about things she had decided in December she would not think about again for a very long time. April became the middle of April, and then the end of it, and Simon's work in Dusty Creek was essentially complete, and he knew it, and he began to feel with increasing clarity the weight of the fact that his reasons for staying were becoming more personal and less official, and that this was a thing he ought to either act on or stop acting on, because the middle ground was not a place that suited his nature. He had been thinking about how to have the conversation he wanted to have with Caroline Bishop, and in the meantime he found reasons to see her that were within the range of plausible, a question about a survey boundary that could have been answered by letter, a document she needed to sign that could have been delivered by Gerald Potts. She met him each time with the same quality of attention she gave everything, careful and direct, and not cold but not warm in a way she would call warm, though he had begun to suspect that the warmth was there and was simply very properly supervised. The Saturday of April the 22nd, there was a social at the Dusty Creek Church Hall. Not the church where the Reverend had given the widow sermon. That congregation had lost Caroline's attendance permanently, but the smaller Baptist church on the east end of town, whose reverend was a younger man named Harper who had the good sense to preach about kindness more than about propriety. It was a spring social, an occasion for the community to collectively confirm that it had survived winter and was intending to continue, with food and music and dancing of the sort that was enthusiastic if not always technically accomplished. Martha Henley told Caroline she was going and that she ought to come too, and she said it in the specific way that meant she would be disappointed if Caroline did not. And because Martha had been good to her throughout the hard months, Caroline went. She wore the blue dress, the one that had been her better dress before the black dresses, which she had put away the week before because she had made a decision that 4 months of black was as much as she owed convention, and that Thomas, who had loved her in blue, would have agreed with her. She did her hair properly, which meant it took 20 minutes more than usual, and she looked at herself in the small mirror and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not grief and not determination but something quieter and more tentative, something she did not name. Simon was at the social because he had been invited by the Reverend Harper, who had learned there was a land commissioner in town, and had made the invitation with the warm hospitality of a man who genuinely liked people. Simon had come because he was getting tired of his own company in the hotel dining room, and also because Martha Henley, who seemed to know everything about everyone in Harlan County, had mentioned to him in passing, very casually, that Caroline Bishop had been persuaded to attend. When he saw her come in the door in the blue dress with Lily beside her, he thought several things in very rapid succession, none of which he said out loud, and then he made his way across the room. "Mrs. Bishop," he said. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. "You look well," he said, and he meant it simply and completely. "Thank you," she said, and accepted the compliment without deflecting it, which was itself something. They talked through the first part of the evening in the loose social way that people do at church hall events, drifting apart and together again as the evening moved around them. He danced with Lily, who was delighted and thoroughly serious about the proper execution of the steps. He watched Caroline talk to Martha Henley with the ease of genuine friendship, and thought about the quality of a woman who maintains warm friendships through grief, without burdening those friends with more than they can hold. When the music slowed, he asked her to dance. He did it simply, without preamble, holding out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she took it. They danced without speaking for the first half of the song, which was a slow waltz played by 2 fiddles that were not quite in tune with each other, but were close enough that it did not matter. She was a good dancer, not formal but rhythmically sure, and dancing with her had the same quality as working the fence with her, a sense of 2 people who are both paying attention to the same thing and therefore do not need to negotiate. "I am going to have to return to Austin," he said, near the end of the song. "My work here is essentially done." She was quiet. "I will be back," he said. "I have reason to come back. There are other cases in the county that require follow-up." He paused. "And I would like to see you again, if that is something you would be open to." She pulled back slightly to look at him. She was a woman who looked at people directly when she had something to assess, and she assessed him now with the same care she gave everything, and he let her, meeting her look without looking away. "It has been 4 months since my husband died," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to have decided something. I am asking whether I can come back." She held his look for another moment. Then she said, "You can come back." He left for Austin 3 days later. He packed his saddlebags and paid his hotel bill and shook Gerald Potts's hand and checked 3 times that his reports were properly organized. Before he left, he rode out to the Bishop homestead. Caroline met him at the gate again. Lily was at school. He said, "I have filed my recommendation with Austin. The transfer of the patent into your name should be confirmed within the month. If there is any delay or any further interference from Crab's people, you write to me at this address." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Directly to me, not to the general office." She took the paper. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and this time there was nothing careful about it, no measured precision, just the real thing, simple and full. He said, "Take care of yourself, Caroline." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. He rode east toward Maristown and then further east toward Austin, and he did not look back, which cost him more than he had expected. The next 6 weeks were full. The General Land Office was backed up with cases from across the state, and Simon worked long hours in Austin in a room that smelled of paper and lamp oil, methodically reviewing claims and writing recommendations, and occasionally looking out the window at the street below and thinking about the Texas Panhandle and the way the light fell on the land out there in the late afternoon, specific and golden, the kind of light that made even difficult things look as if they might resolve. He wrote a letter to Caroline on the 15th of May. He had composed it in his head several times before he wrote it down, and the version he actually wrote was shorter than the versions he had composed mentally, because he was a man who believed in saying what he meant and not adding decorative language around the edges of it. He told her that the confirmation of the land patent was imminent, that he expected the official document to arrive within the week, and that he hoped she and Lily were well. He added, after a brief pause, that he had found himself thinking about the view from her porch and the way the cottonwoods looked along the creek, and that he hoped to see them again before the summer got too far along. She wrote back on the 28th of May. Her letter was also shorter than he had expected, and also direct. She told him the patent confirmation had arrived on the 20th, and that she had held it in her hands for a long time before she was able to put it down. She told him that Lily had started a small garden on her own, initiative that Caroline was choosing to encourage because the interest in growing things, she wrote, seems like a good quality to develop. She told him that the cottonwoods were fully leafed out now, and that the creek was running fast with late snowmelt from the hills, and that the view from the porch in the evening was something she had been sitting with intentionally, paying attention to it, because she had spent 4 months not being sure she would keep it, and she was making a point now of seeing it clearly. She added, at the bottom, that she would not object to a visit if his work brought him back to the county. Simon Rhodes arranged to have his work bring him back to the county at the earliest reasonable opportunity, which turned out to be the 2nd week of June. He told his supervisor in Austin, a compact, serious man named Hargrove, that the Harlan County cases required additional in-person review, which was true, and Hargrove approved the trip. He arrived in Dusty Creek on a Tuesday evening in a warm June dusk. He did not go to the land office. He went to the hotel, washed the trail off himself, changed his shirt, and then saddled the bay again and rode out toward Cutter's Creek. Caroline was on the porch when he rode up. She stood when she saw him, which was not something she would have predicted herself doing, and then stayed where she was while he dismounted and tied the horse and walked toward the porch, and she thought clearly and without great alarm that something in the way he moved, easy and deliberate and thoroughly himself, was something she had been thinking about in her quieter moments for 6 weeks. "You actually came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "People say a lot of things," she said. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. "I know," he said. "I am not people." Something in her face shifted. She said, "No, I suppose you are not." Lily erupted from the house at this point, having heard the horse, and informed Simon with great excitement that her garden had produced its first radishes, which she presented as evidence of her agricultural success. And he examined them with the seriousness they deserved, and said they were excellent radishes, and that she clearly had a gift. And Lily beamed in the uncomplicated way that only children can manage. He stayed for dinner again, and this time the dinner was easier than the first one had been, the three of them falling into a pattern that was almost familiar, Lily talking and being listened to, Caroline cooking and talking while she did it, Simon sitting at the kitchen table and being, without quite planning to, the kind of person who helps without making a fuss about it, getting the water when it was needed, catching the thing Lily nearly knocked off the counter. After Lily was in bed, they sat on the porch again. The night was warm, and the stars were the same extraordinary stars they had been in April, and the creek sound was underneath everything. "I am glad you have the pat," he said. "It is a relief that does not quite have words," she said. "I did not know how afraid I was until the fear was gone." "I understand that," he said. She looked at him. "You said you wanted to see me again," she said. "Not officially." "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. It was a direct question from a direct woman, and she asked it without apology or softening. He thought about how to answer it. "Because I have not wanted to see someone again in a long time," he said. "Not in that way. And because I think you are someone worth knowing. And because I think about this place and Lily climbing things and the way you said you knew the land was right before Thomas did. I think about those things a great deal." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran in the dark. "Thomas has been gone 5 months," she said. "I loved him. I'm going to say that plainly because it is true and because I think a man worth knowing deserves to have it said plainly. He was my husband and he was good and I loved him." "I know," Simon said quietly. "And I am also going to tell you," she continued, "that I am 31 years old and I am not a woman who is interested in pretending that I do not feel things that I feel. I have been sitting on this porch for 6 weeks thinking about things I told myself I was not going to think about yet." "What kind of things?" he asked. She looked at him with the direct look that he had come to understand was simply who she was. "Things like whether a man I met under very peculiar circumstances is as good as he appeared to be in those circumstances," she said. "And whether the way he looked at me when I climbed down from that roof meant what I thought it might mean." "What did you decide?" he said. "I am still deciding," she said. "But I think you should come back as often as your work allows, and I think we should spend the time talking, and I think we will know more when we know more." "That is very sensible," he said. "I'm a sensible woman," she said, and then she smiled, which was the first real full smile he had seen from her, not the careful partial one she deployed when she found something mildly amusing, but the full version, sudden and warm and unexpectedly lovely, and something in Simon Rhodes settled into place in his chest with the quiet certainty of a man who has found something he did not know exactly what shape he was looking for. He came back every 3 weeks through June and July. He always had official reasons, which were real reasons, because the state of land records in Harlan County was genuinely a matter requiring ongoing attention. But the day he arrived was always the evening he rode out to the Bishop homestead, and the evening he left was always the morning after a dinner on the porch in the warm summer dark. They talked about everything. They talked about the land and the law and the particular cruelty of systems that were designed in theory for fairness, and in practice for whoever had the most money and the most patience. They talked about his years in Tennessee, his legal training, the case that had made him decide that the work he most wanted to do was the work of making sure land records were clean and honest, because land was the thing that determined everything else, and the people who were most vulnerable to being cheated out of it were the people who could least afford to be. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents' small farm, about the particular quality of her father's stubbornness which she had inherited and which had driven her mother to distraction, and which she now recognized in herself with something between pride and wry affection. She talked about Thomas without the watchfulness of a woman testing to see whether she is allowed, and he listened without the discomfort of a man who needs her past to be less real in order to feel comfortable about the present. He fixed things when he came. He did not ask, just looked and saw and did. The fence corner that needed reinforcing, the window that stuck, the root cellar door that needed a new hinge. Caroline accepted this with the pragmatism of a woman who needed things fixed, and the additional complexity of a woman who found herself more grateful for it than she had expected, not for the fixing itself, but for the quality of attention it represented, the way he noticed what needed doing and did it without making it a demonstration of anything. In July, Lily informed Simon formally that she had decided she liked him. She said this on a Tuesday evening when he had just helped her build a small fence around her garden to keep the rabbits out, and she said it with the gravity of someone conferring an honor. He thanked her with equal gravity. Caroline, who overheard this from the kitchen doorway, turned away quickly before her face could communicate something she was not quite ready to say out loud. She said it instead on the 3rd of August, a hot evening when the air had not cooled even after the sun was down, and they were sitting on the porch with glasses of water because the warmth was too much for coffee, and Simon had said something that made her laugh, something about a particularly stubborn surveyor he had dealt with in Maristown who had argued with a compass. And in the middle of laughing she had looked at him and felt the thing she had been managing and supervising and carefully observing for 4 months arrive with complete certainty. She stopped laughing. He noticed the change and looked at her. "I have decided," she said. "What have you decided?" he asked. "That you are as good as you appeared to be," she said. "Better, actually, and that I am in love with you, which is terrifying and inconvenient and true." Simon Rhodes set down his glass of water on the porch railing with the particular care of a man who is keeping himself steady. Then he turned to look at her, and she was watching him the way she always watched things, directly and without flinching. "Caroline," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said carefully, "since approximately the moment you climbed down from that roof." She looked at him. "That was April the 3rd, she said. "Yes," he said. "You have been carrying that for 4 months, she said. "You had a great deal on your mind," he said. "I was not going to add to it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his. His hand turned under hers and held it. They stayed that way for a while, with the dark, warm night around them and the creek in the distance and the particular silence of two people who have finally arrived somewhere they had both been moving toward. He kissed her for the first time the following evening, which was not an impulsive thing but a decided one, both of them deciding it at the same moment and meeting accordingly. It was a careful kiss, not tentative but considered, the kind of kiss between two people who have had time to understand something of what they are to each other before the first one, and it had the quality of something begun properly. Eli Crabb made one final attempt in late August. He sent Vickers to Austin, and Vickers filed an appeal with the General Land Office claiming that Simon's review of the Bishop case had been compromised by a personal connection to the claimant, which was, in spirit if not in strict legal fact, an accusation that Simon's recommendation could not be trusted to be impartial. Simon found out about this when his supervisor Hargrove called him into his office on a day when Simon was in Austin for his regular reporting. Hargrove was a small, serious man who had been doing this work for 20 years and had the patience of someone who has outlasted a great many people's bad faith. He told Simon about Vickers' filing. He told him that he was required to take it seriously as a matter of procedure. He asked Simon, in the direct way of a man who expected a direct answer, whether his personal acquaintance with Mrs. Bishop had begun before or after his review of the case. Simon said it had begun after. He explained the timeline precisely. He also said, because he was a man who told the truth in complete sentences, that he was currently courting Mrs. Bishop with the intention of eventually asking her to marry him, and that he believed his recommendation in the Bishop case was sound on the merits, which was demonstrably true given the documentation, and that if Hargrove wished to have another reviewer examine the case independently, Simon was confident that reviewer would arrive at the same conclusion. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that he would have Margolis, the senior commissioner, review the file independently as a matter of closing the loop, and that he expected the finding to confirm Simon's recommendation, and that the Crabbe appeal would then be formally dismissed. It took 3 weeks. Margolis reviewed the file, confirmed Simon's recommendation, and the Crabbe appeal was dismissed in writing on the 17th of September, 1882. The Bishop land patent was formally and finally secure. Simon rode to Dusty Creek the following week and told Caroline in person because he wanted to be there when she heard it. She read the letter from Austin twice, standing on the porch in the September light, and then she looked up at him with something in her face that was full and clear and whole, and she said, "It is really finished." "It is really finished," he said. She sat down on the porch steps. He sat beside her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the afternoon quiet for a long time. "I want to ask you something," he said eventually. "Then ask me," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not immediately, if that is not what you want. I understand that you are still making your way through this year. But I want to tell you that it is my intention, and that I would like to know if you are open to it." She lifted her head and looked at him. "I am open to it," she said. "I am more than open to it." He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small gold thing with a seed pearl in the center that he had carried for 7 years without knowing exactly why, since it had not seemed appropriate for Eliza, and afterward he had simply kept it. He had been carrying it in his breast pocket for 3 weeks. He gave it to her on the porch of the Bishop homestead in the September light, and she put it on and looked at it for a moment and then kissed him properly, without calculation, and he held her the way a man holds someone he has decided is the permanent kind of love and not the temporary kind. Lily, when told about the engagement, was quiet for a moment that felt very long and then said, "Are we going to keep the farm?" "Yes," Caroline said. "Absolutely yes." "And Simon is going to stay," Lily said. "That is the plan," Simon said. Lily considered this. "Good," she said, with the finality of someone closing a matter they are satisfied with. "Because the fence on the east side is going to need work again in the spring, and I cannot help because I will have too much to do in my garden." Caroline laughed. Simon laughed. And Lily, satisfied with the outcome of the conversation, went back to whatever she had been doing. They were married in November of 1882. It was a small wedding, because Caroline was a woman who preferred things done simply and well over things done elaborately and badly, and because Dusty Creek's social landscape was one she navigated with care, aware of who had been kind and who had been waiting to see which way things would go. The ceremony was in Reverend Harper's church, because Harper was a man she trusted. Martha Henley stood with her. Simon's colleague from Austin, a young surveyor named Davis who had ridden the 3 days specifically, stood with Simon. Lily wore her best dress and stood between the two of them during the ceremony with the expression of someone performing an important ceremonial function. After the ceremony, there was a small dinner at the hotel, and then they drove out to the farm in the blue November dusk, all 3 of them in the wagon with the horse at an easy walk, and the land was bare and winter-brown, but it was theirs, and they could see it clearly. Simon had arranged to transfer his work to the Harlan County District permanently. It had required some negotiation with Hargrove, who had eventually agreed that having an experienced commissioner resident in the district, rather than rotating through, was a sensible arrangement that would prevent the sort of backlog and mismanagement that had characterized the previous system. Simon would ride a circuit of the county, but his home base would be Dusty Creek, which meant his home could be the Bishop homestead, which was what he wanted. He had fixed up the house over the autumn, adding a room on the back that they had planned together, because Caroline had opinions about the layout of a house that were both specific and correct, and he had learned by this point to present his ideas alongside hers and let the best plan prevail, which was usually a combination of the two. The new room had 2 windows facing east, which Caroline said was important because she liked morning light, and a proper wood floor that Simon had laid himself over 2 weekends with Davis helping on the second. The first winter of their marriage was cold and close and good. Simon came to understand the particular rhythms of the farm from the inside, the early mornings, the animal care, the planning of supplies, and the monitoring of weather with the careful attention of people who know that their margin for error is not large. He was useful in the way that a person is useful when they apply real intelligence to the specific demands of a particular life, rather than general competence, to a generic version of what they think the life ought to look like. He also kept his work, riding out 3 days a week on a circuit that took him through the county's smaller communities, reviewing files, meeting with claimants, doing the patient work of making sure that what had happened to Caroline Bishop happened to as few other people as possible. In February, he came home from a 2-day circuit to find Caroline sitting at the kitchen table with a particular quality of attention on her face. Lily was at school. The house was quiet. He sat down. He looked at her. He said, "What?" She looked at him with the directness that was always her and said, "I am going to have a baby." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. His face had the particular undone quality of a man who is very happy and is not trying to manage it. When he said, "August," she said, he brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I wanted to tell you before I was certain, but I am certain now." "Does Lily know?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "I thought we could tell her together." They told Lily that evening, and Lily absorbed the information with her characteristic seriousness, thought about it for a considerable time, and then asked whether the baby would share her room or the new room, because she had opinions about privacy that she had apparently been developing and wished to share. They negotiated this with the same approach they applied to all negotiations with Lily, which was to take her seriously and find a solution that addressed her actual concern, which turned out to be that she did not want someone else touching her things. This was entirely manageable. The spring of 1883 arrived, and the land came back to life with the particular insistence of Texas spring, fast and full, and not asking permission. Simon planted with Caroline, who managed the farm's agriculture with the authority of someone who had been doing it for years, and was not looking to hand it over but was grateful for additional hands, and more than that, grateful for a partner who asked what she needed rather than telling her what he thought she should do. They put in corn and beans and a larger kitchen garden than the year before, and Lily's personal garden expanded to a size that required a formal border discussion with Caroline about where exactly the line was. The summer was hot. The baby arrived in August, right on time, a boy with Simon's dark hair and Caroline's stubborn jaw and a pair of lungs that announced his arrival in no uncertain terms. They named him Thomas James, Thomas for the man who had loved this land and made it possible and deserved to have something named in his honor, and James for Simon's father, who had died when Simon was 20 and who had been, by all accounts Simon gave, a decent and hardworking man. Simon held his son for the first time and stood in the east-facing room that got the morning light, the room they had built together, and looked at the boy's face with the expression of a man who has not expected to feel exactly this much and is not trying to manage it at all. Caroline watched him from the bed, tired and clear-eyed, and felt the fullness of things, how Thomas the First had loved this land and she had fought for it, and Simon had heard her case, and now there was this child with both of their names and this room they had built with their own hands, and the land outside that was properly theirs in every record that had ever been written. And there was Lily asleep in the next room, having decided that she approved of her brother after a thorough examination of his hands and feet. She felt the fullness of it, without trying to make it into a simpler story than it was. It was a complicated fullness, holding the grief and the love and the present all at once, and she was old enough to know that this was what real happiness usually felt like, not simple and unalloyed, but full and honest and worth everything it had cost to get here. Simon looked up from the baby and found her watching him. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, the boy against his chest. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" she said. "For letting me come back," he said. "For deciding." She reached up and touched his face. "You were worth deciding about," she said. Young Thomas James Bishop Rhodes grew in the way that babies do, loudly and rapidly, and with a complete disregard for his parents' schedule, which Lily found alternately interesting and inconvenient, and which she documented in a small journal she had started keeping in September with the intention of being a thorough observer of events. By the time he was 6 months old, he had thoroughly reorganized the household's routines, and by the time he was a year old, he had added himself to the list of people Lily was responsible for looking out for. A responsibility she took with the seriousness she gave all responsibilities. Dusty Creek in 1884 was not the same town it had been in 1882, though it was still a small town on a dirt main street with 3 saloons and a church, and a land office where Gerald Potts still worked, now with a level of procedural care and accuracy that he had developed under Simon's supervision, and which he applied with something approaching pride. The Crab Cattle Company had lost its bid for expansion in Harlan County and had turned its attention to more distant pastures, which suited everyone in the county who had not been on Crab's payroll. Several of the smaller homestead claims that had been in uncertain states of review were now confirmed and settled, and the families on those claims were working their land with the particular energy of people who know the ground beneath them is genuinely theirs. Simon was known in the county as a fair man, which was the most useful thing to be known, as if your work was what his work was. People came to him with their papers and their problems and their questions, and he gave them his time and his accuracy and his judgment, and when he could not help them, he told them so directly and pointed them towards someone who could. Caroline sometimes rode the circuit with him in the easier months, when Lily was in school, and Thomas was old enough to be watched by Martha Henley, because she understood the work and had an eye for the kinds of claims that needed careful scrutiny, and also because she liked riding and liked being alongside Simon in the work, the same way she had liked being alongside Thomas in the work, which she no longer felt guilty about understanding as 2 separate and complete things. They had been in their lives together long enough by the spring of 1884 to have established the particular rhythms that belong only to people who have truly decided each other, the ways of speaking and not speaking, the distribution of difficulty, the morning routine that had developed without anyone designing it and was now as natural as the structure of the house. They argued occasionally, because both of them were people with opinions and the willingness to state them, and their arguments had the quality of 2 people who are arguing about the actual point and not about something else underneath it, which meant they resolved quickly and left nothing behind. On a warm evening in April of 1884, the 2nd anniversary of the morning Caroline had climbed onto the roof of the land office. She was standing at the kitchen counter and Simon came in from the barn, and she turned to look at him and said, without particularly planning to, "Do you know what day it is?" He thought about it. He was good with dates, it was professional habit. "April the 3rd, he said. She nodded. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she agreed. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him. And through the window they could see Lily out in the yard, helping Thomas, who was now a determined 8-month-old, sit upright in the patch of grass, which Thomas found enormously satisfying and was attempting to communicate with great volume. "If you had told me that morning," Caroline said, that a man was going to ride into town and actually hear my case and then come back 3 weeks later and then keep coming back. She stopped. What? He said. I would have said that sounds very unlikely, she said. It was unlikely, he said. He pressed his mouth against her hair. I was going to the land office. That was the only thing I knew I was doing. Well, she said, I am glad you were. So am I, he said, extremely. She turned in his arms and looked at him. 2 years of marriage and the quality of looking at him had not diminished, still had the original clarity of a woman who looks at people directly and sees them. I love you, she said. I know, he said. I love you too, very much. Outside, Lily had apparently decided that Thomas needed to understand something about the garden, and was explaining it to him in serious tones, which Thomas was receiving with the wide-eyed attention of a small person who is new to most things and finds them all interesting. The evening light came in from the west, warm and golden, the kind of light the Texas panhandle does that makes the ordinary look consecrated, and the farm stretched away from the house toward the creek. The cottonwoods leafed out again, the fields going in for another season, the fences standing straight, the well working, the house solid and well-made, and full of the particular noise and life of a place where people are genuinely at home. Caroline did not look away from Simon's face, but she was aware of all of it, the land and the evening and the children and the creek and the work ahead and the work behind. And she thought about the morning 2 years ago when she had pulled herself up onto that tar-paper roof with the cold determination of a woman who had nothing left to do but make herself impossible to ignore. And she thought that she had not known then. She could not possibly have known that the case she was fighting for was going to be the thing that led her here. But here was where she was, and here was good. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Simon and Caroline sat on the porch as they had done so many times now that the chairs had worn into particular positions in the wood, and the sitting was easy and comfortable and full of everything that had accumulated between them. The stars came out. The creek ran. The land was dark and present around them, the same land she had fought for and kept, the land that had cost Thomas his years of labor and had cost her 4 months of grief and determination and one memorable morning on a rooftop, and which had given her, in the end, more than she had expected to have. Tell me something, Simon said into the quiet. What? She said. Tell me something you are glad about, he said. It was a thing they sometimes did in the evenings, a habit that had started without either of them naming it and that she had found over time to be one of the most useful habits of her life. She thought. The creek ran. The stars were very clear. Thomas James smiled at me this morning before he was fully awake, she said. Just opened his eyes and found my face and smiled. That was the first thing today. That is a good first thing, Simon said. And Lily told me she wants to be a surveyor, she added. Does she? Simon said, and she could hear the particular quality of happiness in his voice. She said she has been thinking about it for a while, Caroline said. She said she thinks knowing where things are and making sure it is recorded correctly is important work. She paused. She also said she would be better at it than most of the surveyors she has observed, which, to be fair, is probably accurate. Absolutely accurate, Simon agreed. And you, she said, you are something I am glad about. Every day still you are something I am glad about. He reached over and took her hand. I will never stop being glad you climbed that roof, he said. Someone had to, she said, which made him laugh, low and warm in the April dark, and she laughed with him, and it went out into the night air and dispersed into the particular Texas stillness that had been there before them, and would be there long after, indifferent and enormous and beautiful. The kind of country that does not give you anything easily but that holds, in its difficulty and its distances and its extraordinary light. A kind of scale that makes the human things that happen within it feel both very small and very significant at once. They sat on that porch until the night got properly cool, and then they went inside to their house that they had built together, and the children were asleep in their rooms, and the land was all around them, confirmed and documented and genuinely theirs. And Simon Rhodes and Caroline Bishop were exactly where they intended to be. And the story of how they got there was not simple, and it was not without cost. But it was honest, and it was whole, and it was theirs, and it was enough. It was, in the way of things that are earned rather than given, considerably more than enough.